All right, here we go. We're going to do a little bit of exam prep by practicing with the Utah Highway Patrol request for evaluation proposals. That was an exam that I gave a few years ago. And the approach we're going to take to this is that I'm going to go through the evaluation proposal first and kind of make comments on the content and clues that the content gives us about how to complete the exam, how to design the evaluation. And then when we're done going through the exam and sort of working through each section and talking about that piece, then we'll come over here to the final exam question topic areas document that has these notes filled in. These notes are just intended to help you kind of think through what these different categories are, and we'll make sure that we have everything we need to fill those in. So starting out with our introduction, the Utah Highway Patrol is interested in helping Utah drivers to avoid preventable accidents. Officers report that fewer secondary accidents appear to happen when an accident is immediately moved off the freeway to the shoulder or emergency lane. So right there we're seeing sort of a mental model that is taking the place of kind of a logic model. We have this idea that there's a cause and effect relationship between moving accidents to the side of the road and secondary accidents happening. The practice of immediately moving accidents off the freeway is not currently common. That piece is important for figuring out what the stage of program development is. This is saying that we don't have a program that's actually being implemented at the moment. Since changing the scene of the accident makes it more difficult to investigate the accident and determine fault. However, we believe that this practice can save lives and reduce property damage. We want to test whether the speed with which accident-related vehicles are removed to the side of the road has a significant impact on 1, the quantity, and 2, the severity of secondary accidents. So one of the very first things that you're going to need to watch for in the exam is a clear evaluation question. That doesn't mean that there's no material previously that will be useful to you. There might be information there that you're going to use, but for sure one of the things you want to make sure that you do before you do anything else is identify a nice, clear evaluation questions. So that's here. Does the speed with which accident-related vehicles are removed to the side of the road have significant impact on the quantity and severity of secondary accidents? So the next thing that happens in this exam paper here is that we define secondary accidents as accidents that are due to the following 3 things. Swerving or stopping, unusual traffic patterns, and inattention to the road or rubbernecking. So what's happened here is that you did not have to define the construct of secondary accidents. So this is given for you, and that'll be important later when you try to figure out some of what you're looking for in the later documents that we'll see here in a moment. Among the primary challenges in developing an evaluation, okay, whenever I say that there's a primary challenge, that means that you should rise to that challenge and do it. So those are always going to be cues that you want to pay attention, and this is something that you're going to need to report to me during the exam. Among the primary challenges in developing an evaluation will be determining which secondary accidents occur as a result of any given primary accident, since there's not currently any means for determining whether an accident is considered primary or secondary. So one of the things you're going to need to be able to do is go through the documentation, identify different accidents as either primary accidents or secondary accidents, and that'll be an important piece of designing this evaluation. Another challenge will be managing variation in traffic accident patterns based on time of day, location, weather, and road conditions. In other words, there's other stuff going on at the same time as these accidents and the removal of the accidents to the side of the road. So this should be immediately kind of a clue as to how we're going to think about designing this evaluation, because it should be apparent at this point that a key piece of this evaluation is going to be managing history effects and ruling out potentially spurious relationships. So we're going to sort of pop that into our heads and kind of keep that in the back of our minds as we move forward through this. In addition to identifying an operational definition for secondary accidents, successful evaluation proposals will clearly and explicitly identify operational measures. In other words, what is the specific measurement that you're going to use for speed of removal of accident from freeway, severity of secondary accidents, and quantity of secondary accidents. So those are going to be the things that you need to measure in this evaluation and you need to relate to each other through your evaluation design. The other thing that's given here is that these need to be based on emergency dispatch recordings and accident reports. So there's no expectation that you're going to go beyond those two sources of data. Everything that you have been tasked with doing in this section should be done through the emergency dispatch recordings and accident reports. So you don't have to get super creative with how you're going to measure each of these things. What you really need to do is look within the description of the dispatch recordings and the accident reports, which we'll see in a moment, and look for items within that you'll be able to use in designing the microstructure of your evaluation. Data and resource limitations. This evaluation is a high priority for the department, so we will commit necessary money and human resources to any proposal that analyzes existing or future data from the following sources. And here we get a little more description of those two data sources. The first one is the emergency dispatch recordings, including, this is important, the time when an accident was reported and the time when an officer reports appearing on the scene of the accident. And then we also have this information that officers remain in contact with dispatchers until the accident is completely resolved. So we have a running transcript of what has happened from the time the accident was initially reported and the time that the officer initially appears on the scene of the accident. So this whole thing appears to be time-stamped, and any conversation happening between the officer and the dispatcher is part of the data that we can use. Standardized accident reports completed by responding officers are the second type of data that you have, and that includes data about the nature, location, and severity of the accident, and the report form, this is the actual report form for accidents, is attached at the end of the exam. So that's the other place that you're going to look for variables to measure those items that were identified earlier as key things that you want to operationalize. Note that these are the only available sources of data about accidents for the evaluation, and no changes to current standardized accident report forms will be allowed. In other words, I'm limiting the scope of the options that you have. That's intended to make this exam easier and also to sort of limit the options that can be best practice in this situation. Other data, for example, weather and road conditions, can be appended to the database from other sources for the purpose of analysis. So in other words, if you want to add a couple of other variables and imagine databases as those might come from, that's fine. But again, we've given you a list already of what those control variables might be, and I'm not expecting you to sort of know where those specific sources would come from. You do note, however, that even though you have all of the money and human resources that you need, which means there are no limitations there, there is this additional limitation. The statistical data systems can handle only 10,000 rows and 30 columns of data at a time. In other words, the most you can have is 30 variables and 10,000 observations. So evaluations should take this limitation into account. If you do suggest additional data sources, be sure to identify the unit of analysis at which those additional pieces of information will be considered. So this 10,000 row limit is important because it's one of the only main limitations that you've been provided. So I'm just going to sort of skip over here to the form. We're going to talk about the form again in a minute. But when I talk about main threats or issues, we've already identified two of those that we're going to design around. One of them is this 10,000 row limit. That's really going to influence the sampling that we can do. In other words, how many observations we can have, and so that'll change the way we approach some of that. The other threat or issue was the need to control for some of those items above the weather, for example, and other traffic information, that sort of stuff. So that history threat is another one of those main threats or issues that we would want to design this evaluation around. Other than that, we're pretty free in scope. Although we do really only have those two primary data sources, everything else is just control variables. The main data is going to come only from those two data sources. So if you wanted to identify that as a threat or issue, that would be fine as well. All right. This piece, this next section of the exam document talks about programs to implement if accident removal is found to be successful. We're currently seeking funding for 3 programs from the Office of the Governor and the Utah State Legislature to the practice of accident removal. The programs for which we're seeking funding are officer training, dispatcher campaign, and public awareness, and each of those is described here. The purpose of that is that we believe that those programs will improve the percentage of accidents that are quickly removed from the road and the speed with which they're removed. The other purpose of that, of course, is to prevent accidents, save taxpayer money, and ultimately save lives. So the current evaluation will help us to convince funders, this is important, to give us the resources needed to implement these new programs. So there's some clues there about two different things, both evaluation stakeholders and the stage of program development. That's how we're going to use this information here. So let's go ahead, since we're pretty much at the end of the exam document, let's go ahead and jump over here to our little cheat sheet and talk through how we would approach each element of this evaluation design. So the first piece is identifying a clear evaluation question. In every exam that I give you, this will be outlined in some part of the exam. So you shouldn't have to invent an evaluation question. You should be able to more or less read back to me the appropriate piece of the exam and tell me that that's what you're designing to. So in this case, we're testing whether the speed with which accident-related vehicles are removed to the side of the road have a significant impact on the quantity and severity of secondary accidents. One of the things you'll notice is that in sort of this little notes section, I've suggested that you should identify whether there are subparts to the question, like different outcomes or traits that need to be observed. In this case, that is true. There are two pieces that we need to look at. We need to look at the quantity of secondary accidents and the severity of those secondary accidents. So in the exam, you're going to want to make sure that you address both quantity and severity. The second piece is evaluation stakeholders. Again, there are two pieces to identifying an evaluation stakeholder. The first one is that this is someone who's going to read the evaluation report. Once the data has already been collected and analyzed and there are findings, an evaluation stakeholder will actually read either the original report or some version of it, like a web story about it or an infographic or any of that sort of thing. The second thing is that an evaluation stakeholder needs to make some decision as a result of having that information. So we have several evaluation stakeholders that have been identified here, and the key to sort of passing this piece of the exam well is answering this question: what decisions will they make? So the first is the Utah Highway Patrol itself. And one decision that they will make is pursuing funding for programs that will move accidents to the side of the road faster. If the evaluation shows that that's not effective, they probably won't pursue that funding and probably won't try to implement those programs. So that's one evaluation stakeholder. The other evaluation stakeholders were identified down here toward the end of the exam. We have the Office of the Governor and the Utah State Legislature, and their role is that of funders. So they are going to consider whether or not it's appropriate to give funding for these programs, and the evaluation will help them determine whether or not they want to fund programs to help move accidents to the side of the road faster. So those are the main evaluation stakeholders that are explicitly identified in this exam. The next thing we need to do is identify the stage of program development. So as I alluded to earlier, this section really does a good job of helping us to narrow down what that stage of program development is. So we're not really at the assessment of social problems and needs because we know that we want to reduce accidents, save lives, reduce damage, all of those things. We know that that's our goal. And the reason that we have these three alternatives here is so that you know that design of program alternatives has already occurred. What hasn't occurred is a selection of a program alternative. In other words, the Utah Highway Patrol has not picked how they are going to actively try to get people to move accidents to the side of the road. So in terms of program development, this is the stage that they're in, selection of program alternative. Now, the next thing we need to do is identify the type of evaluation. So this can be a little bit tricky because the material for both of these questions comes from page 40, that table that has stages of program development, and it has evaluation questions, and then it has types of evaluations. Ideally, in a textbook world, your stage of program development would match your type of evaluation. But in the real world, and thus in our simulated world in the exam, that's not necessarily true. So we're going to treat these two things as independent of each other. And so we're going to identify the type of evaluation regardless of whether it matches the stage of program development. So the type of evaluation in this case, I think there are actually two justifiable answers. The first one is a needs assessment. In other words, is there a need for the program? And we'll determine that if moving vehicles to the side of the road really does reduce bad stuff happening, then that helps us know that that is a need that we have, and we need a program that will help people to achieve that. So I think that's an appropriate way to sort of view this, although really I think what I would more expect is to look at an outcome evaluation. I think what they're asking for here is an outcome evaluation. In other words, what is the outcome or result or impact of moving cars to the side of the road after a primary accident? What kind of impact does that have on secondary accidents? So either of those is a justifiable answer if you justify it appropriately. Again, I have a slight preference for the program outcomes approach because I think that's really what they're asking for. But I think a needs assessment is arguably an appropriate choice at that as well. Here you can talk about whether that evaluation type matches the stage of program development. In this case, it doesn't. And you would just say the reason for that is because the program is trying to achieve a specific outcome, but we don't know if that outcome actually follows the action that the programs are intended to create. All right, I already addressed main threats or issues earlier. I just want to point out that depending on the kind of question that you're asking, that'll really give you clues about the main threats or issues that you're looking for in terms of internal validity. So if you have a program type that you're trying to evaluate that has observations over time, in other words, you're following a person or a group or an environment over time, and you're gathering multiple observations over different days or weeks or months or years, then you're going to have threats to validity that you need to design around that have to do with regression to the mean or maturation. Those are things that might suggest that the measurements that you're getting and any changes in those measurements are just sort of the natural result of progression in time. If, on the other hand, you have a situation where you're trying to test the impact of a program on one group and compare that with the impact on another group, then you're going to have all of the types of validity threats that involve two groups, right? So you'll have all of the compensatory rivalry and demoralization, the possibility of selection bias, which is always a really big one in that case, or diffusion of the treatment. All of those, that whole set of internal validity threats might be an issue. In our case, we already know at this point that what we're looking for is a causal relationship between an X variable, speed with which we move accidents to the side of the road, and a Y variable, the severity and damage that happens as a result in those secondary accidents. So this is a correlation kind of question. Because it's a correlation question, we're really going to be concerned about non-spuriousness, in other words, history effects. So that's the main threat or issue that we're going to identify for this specific exam. The other threats that should appear here are practical limitations that have been identified. So in this case, we have limited data sources, and we also have a limited availability of rows for the analysis that we're going to do. So we can only handle a certain amount of data. Those are the primary limitations that we're working with. So finally now, we're in a position to be able to talk about the macro structure for our evaluation. In other words, how are we going to set up the big picture of this evaluation? The first question to address is, what is the target population? And in this case, the target population is accidents. It's the set of accidents that have occurred. And we're looking at both primary accidents, because we want to know how quickly they're moved off to the side of the road, and secondary accidents because we want to know how bad those secondary accidents are. So that's what we're trying to figure out. The sampling frame we're going to use is reported accidents, accidents that have been reported to us by the Utah Highway Patrol. The sampling method we're going to use really kind of depends on your preferences in this case. Typically, you would start kind of at the top with a census and rule out different approaches until you get down to the one that seems like the most probable or feasible one. So in this case, our first choice would be a census sample. Now, depending on how many accidents there are reported in the Utah Highway Patrol databases, we may or may not actually be able to get a census. So there are a couple ways to think about that. One is, we can figure out about how many accidents there are in any given time frame, like a year, and decide to just take a census of a time period that limits us to 10,000 rows. So let's imagine for a minute that there are about 5,000 reported accidents per year. I totally just made that number up. In that case, we would want to limit this evaluation to 2 years. And we could do a census sample, but it would be limited to 2 years worth of data. Now we need to weigh that against the ability to do something like a stratified random sample where we could use the whole body of data and then pick out randomly different accidents that occur, but we would stratify them by something like time of year or weather or the type of accident, or we could do by the type of road that those were on. So a stratified random sample might make sense as well because of that. The last one that I think would be at all appropriate would be a full-on random sample where you basically just take all of the data that's available from the Utah Highway Patrol and you just pull 10,000 cases at random. And I think that's justifiable as well because it's expected that you would get each type of accident proportionally to how it actually happens in practice. So any of those three sampling options is appropriate and justifiable. The points are really going to be based on sort of the confidence with which you suggest your alternative and the confidence with which you're able to justify that with a correct justification. The next questions are, do I need to have multiple groups? In other words, am I trying to like run a randomized controlled trial or do a comparison? In this case, you could, because we have the option of either doing a retrospective study where we're looking at data that already exists, or we could do a prospective study where we could do something like a randomized controlled trial. I think there's some problems with running a randomized controlled trial in this case. You could certainly do it, and that would be a justifiable thing to do. One of the challenges, though, is if you try to randomize things, for example, by having a certain county or stretch of road that's randomly assigned to a program to sort of speed up moving cars to the side of the road, people don't really stay on one stretch of road or within even a single county. And so even though you're trying to run a program in one part of Utah, it's likely that that would have effects elsewhere. And so the randomized controlled trial probably wouldn't do exactly what you need it to be able to do. You'd have too much treatment diffusion. So although that's a potential option, I think there are enough downsides to it that it's probably not worth that additional effort. And I would just stick with the retrospective evaluation where you don't have different groups or random assignment. You just have one big group of all the accidents that have already occurred, and you gather the data from that. The next question is whether you need to have multiple observation points in time. In other words, are you doing a pre and post test, or are you going to go back and observe the same people or groups multiple times? And in this case, that's not true. We don't have the ability to, for example, follow up with people who've had an accident because that's not within the 2 data sources that we've been limited to. So we're not going to be observing, we're not going to do things multiple points in time. For each given accident, we're just going to observe it once. The next question is how you're going to integrate qualitative and quantitative data. This is the kind of question that I would typically come back to after you know exactly what you're doing with your qualitative and quantitative measurement. And regardless of when you talk about that in the exam, I would come back and fill that in within this box for you. All right, so let's talk about measurement for a minute. We have qualitative measurement options and we have quantitative measurement options. Now the 2 types of data that we have in this exam are emergency dispatch recordings, and we have a little bit of information about those here. That's clearly going to be qualitative data if we're listening to the recordings and pulling out information about things like accident severity from that. But the more likely thing that we're going to pull from the emergency dispatch recordings is the times. So even though this is fundamentally qualitative data, the data that we're going to pull from it is going to end up being quantitative. We're going to use timestamps and use quantities from that. The second piece of data that we have is our standardized accident reports. And I'm going to scroll down to where that is, but first I want us to sort of remember what we're looking for. So we're looking for the severity of accidents, secondary accidents. Well, first we're looking for whether they're a secondary accident at all. So that's important. We need to look for that. And then we're going to look for the severity of those accidents, and the quantity of secondary accidents is really just going to come as a derivative of whether or not it's a secondary accident in the first place. So the 2 things we need to look for in the reports are how bad the accidents are and whether or not they're secondary accidents. So let's scroll down and sort of look at this document. The first thing you should look for is anything that is a clue about how bad that accident might have been. So I've had the opportunity to sort of look at this before, and so I know it might take you a minute to sort of skim through this and kind of parse all the data that's here. That's part of the time that you'll use during the exam. But if you look here, there's a section that talks about the parts that were damaged and the cost of repair. So that's going to give us some idea of the severity of that accident. And then down here, there's a section on injury. So that also is going to give us some idea of the severity of that accident. So any of that data there is going to give us a sense of severity, and we can use those codes as data in our evaluation. So that's one of those key measurement pieces. The other thing that we were looking for is whether or not this is a secondary accident. And so what I want to point out here is that there's a written description in addition to like damage to property other than vehicles and stuff. Up here you've got describe what happened. And so this is qualitative data that can be coded for whether or not this is a secondary accident. And again, we already have in the exam what we're looking for there. Was there any swerving or stopping abruptly to avoid an accident? Were there unusual traffic patterns caused by an accident that were reported there? Was there any inattention to the road due to interest in the scene of the accident? So any of those 3 things in that qualitative description of the accident would cue us into the fact that it was in fact a secondary accident. So when we think about our qualitative measurement, whether or not it's a secondary accident is going to come from that qualitative coding. And the quantitative measurement of the time of the first primary accident being moved to the side of the road, that will be handled by coding the qualitative dispatch reports. And then the severity of the accident will come from a quantitative component in the accident reports as well. So then we need to think a little bit about our qualitative and quantitative analysis. The qualitative analysis, the main question we have is, are we using open coding or are we using closed coding? In other words, are we going to go into that qualitative data and look for themes and allow the data to tell us what's interesting? Or do we have something that we are specifically looking for when we go to the data? In this case, it's the latter. We know that what we're looking for is whether or not it's a secondary accident. We actually have a pretty good coding rubric here, so we would just code it yes or no, whether it was a secondary accident. So that's how we would do our qualitative analysis piece here. The quantitative analysis piece is a little different. Now you'll remember that we have a few variables here. We have the speed with which accident-related vehicles are removed to the side of the road. That's an X variable. That's a cause variable. Now we have a couple of different possible outcomes. You'll also remember that we wanted to address time of day, location, and weather conditions, and we can't do that with a randomized control trial. I mean, we can, that's one way to do it, but in this case, that's probably not how we're going to approach it. What we're going to do instead is treat this like a regression analysis. We are going to use quantity and then separately severity of secondary accidents as our dependent variables. Our key independent variable of interest is going to be the speed with which accident-related vehicles are moved to the side of the road. And then our control variables are going to be things like time of day, location, weather, and road conditions. So those all can be tossed into a regression analysis, and that's what we would use to determine what's going on here. So linear regression analysis is what we're going to use since our dependent variable is interval level. It's time, probably elapsed time in something like minutes or seconds. All right, so the next thing we need to do, now that we know the variables that we have, how we're measuring them, what the overall structure of the evaluation is, we need to interpret the results. So how will we know whether the speed with which accidents are moved to the side of the road increases or decreases the severity and quantity of secondary accidents? Well, we'll run that regression and we'll look at the X variable for speed. And we're going to look at what that statistic tells us. So if it's a positive correlation, that would mean that lower speeds, in other words, smaller amounts of time, or moving things away faster, would decrease, we think, the quantity and severity of secondary accidents. In other words, if we have a relationship of small to small, or a positive correlation, then that's going to be a good result. If it's the opposite, in other words, if we have smaller amounts of time and larger quantities or larger severities, then that's going to be an inverse relationship, a negative relationship, and that would tell us that this relationship doesn't hold, that the speed actually makes these two things worse. The last possibility is that there's no correlation at all between these two things, in which case, again, our mental model wasn't working correctly. So that's how we would interpret the results of this exam. At this point, we have designed the evaluation. We've talked it all the way through. So all we have left to do is evaluate our work. So the first thing we're going to do to evaluate the design that we've come up with is talk about the feasibility. In other words, have we met the limitations that we were constrained by? And because we were careful to design to all of those things, the answer is yes. We have no more than 10,000 observations because of our sampling approach. It's a feasible plan given the data that we have. We know exactly where all the variables are going to come from. And so within the limitations provided, we have designed a good evaluation plan. So this is an opportunity to sort of think that through. Now, if you get to this point and realize that you failed to accommodate some of the limitations, that's fine. Just take this opportunity to talk about kind of what you did and why and how you would adjust it to then fit within the constraints. Then we're going to look at our validity stuff. So you're going to take each item of validity in turn and just kind of talk about what are the threats that are remaining from given this plan. So because we're dealing with correlation, we know that history is always, always, always going to be an issue. Even though we have control variables and we've done the best that we can, history effects are always a potential problem. So you would want to identify that here and say there may be variables that we didn't account for that might matter. I can't think of anything else that's a really glaring validity issue in this case. You might think of some additional things that I hadn't thought of, in which case, more power to you. That's great. Bring up whatever validity concerns that you have. Oh, sorry, I was talking about that as though it was internal validity, but I was highlighting construct validity. I was just talking about internal validity threats. Construct validity, you're going to want to talk about the measurement. What's the quality of the measurements that we have here? And you would think about things like whether there's a restriction of range and whether the constructs are clearly explicated and any of the other validity threats that are identifiable on the construct validity list that you're concerned about. I think construct validity is pretty low-hanging fruit for this exam. There are several items that you could be sort of concerned about, and raising really a handful of those would be appropriate in this case. We just talked about internal validity, so that brings us to external validity. In most cases, external validity is not going to be a huge concern unless the exam explicitly asks you to apply the results of the evaluation from one setting to a different setting or set of people, or any of the four ways that you can alter this. In the case of this exam, external validity is not an issue. We're evaluating Utah accidents for a Utah audience, and we're not trying to extrapolate the results of our evaluation to any other setting or group of people or treatment or set of outcomes, and so we're not really worried about external validity in this case. The only reason you would be worried about external validity is if I asked you a question during the exam, during the oral portion, and asked you something like, let's say you do find that moving accidents to the side of the road reduces the severity of secondary accidents, and that's true in Utah. What if Nevada wanted to then build a policy based on Utah's study? Finally, we're going to look at statistical conclusion validity. Now, statistical conclusion validity really comes up primarily in the analysis of the work that you're doing, and not so much in the design of the evaluation itself. So you'd be more worried about the specific statistical tests that you're applying here. The one exception to that that really can apply to an evaluation would be low statistical power. So if you had a small n study, then that might be a concern here, and that's usually the statistical conclusion validity concern that I would raise. But that's not an issue in this case. We have 10,000 accidents that we're analyzing, and so we don't really need to worry about low statistical power, and we're not really expecting a lot of the other issues to come up with that. So that brings us to the very end of the exam. We did the whole thing, both talking through the entire exam in different pieces and actually walking through step by step what are the pieces that you would report during the oral portion of that. And I went through some other scenarios and how to sort of flexibly think about this exam format, since you'll be getting a different scenario in your actual exam. So I think that suggests that it's possible for you to do this and still have time to think about it and vet your work and go back and forth and look at a few additional resources. So good luck as you continue to study for this exam, and I look forward to seeing you in my office.